Welcome, everyone. I see people joining us for our 10 o'clock webinar. We're going to let those join the room, and then we'll get started right at 10 a.m. Eastern, which is right about now, but I still see some more people rolling in. So those of you who are here, welcome. This is the All Hazards Consortium's virtual discussion series on synchronizing information for disaster response logistics. And we will get started in just a few seconds. Feel free to use the chat to say hello to the panelists and let us know where you're from while we wait for others to join. Okay, welcome to those of us just joining. This is part 2 in a 3-part series on synchronizing info for disaster response logistics.
You know, Doug, every time I hear the word logistics, I smile because that has taken on so many definitions lately, right? Like, what even is it anymore, right? And I know you're talking to.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun having conversations about supply chain in the food business.
There's another one, right? Supply chain, right?
All right, well, why don't we kick things off? Thanks to those of you who just dialed in. This will be the operational perspective of synchronizing information for disaster response logistics. The All Hazards Consortium has divided this up into 3 parts. And on Monday, we talked about the strategy behind all of this, our fleet movement app and the SICE, which you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. And then tomorrow at 10, we will talk about the technical approach, even see a demo of the Fleet Movement app. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the operations and how the states and owner-operators work together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Johnson. I'm a Director of Conferences and Events for the All Hazards Consortium, and I'm pleased to be the administrator for today's virtual discussion. Just a quick couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We are recording today's discussion, so we will send all of you a link after today, or maybe a little bit later today, so that you can share that with your colleagues and peers or watch it again if you like. And I would also like to encourage you to please use either the Q&A function if you have a question, or the chat if you have a comment. We like to hear from you, any comments, suggestions, maybe you have some solutions of your own, or even just to say hi. So I wanted to talk about how the next 90 minutes is going to run today. We'll spend a few minutes in explaining a little bit more about the Fleet Movement app and what SICEnet is. And then for the first part of our discussion with our speakers, we'll talk about the importance of situational awareness. We'll move into operations and logistics, again, between the state and the owner operators, and then we'll spend the third part of the discussion talking about some route planning. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, but again, you can feel free to ask your Q&A at any time by using the Q&A function, and then hopefully we'll have more dialogue towards the end of the call today. Today, we'll hear from Ms. Bethany Elliott, who is the State Training Officer and Interim Private Sector Liaison with Alabama Emergency Management. Doug Baker, who is the VP of Industry Relations at the Food Industry Association. And last but not least, Dave Vanderbloemen, the CEO of DB Consulting. And Dave used to be with Dominion Energy, so he has a lot of experience in synchronizing info for logistics. So I would love to turn it over to our Executive Director, Tom Moran. Tom?
Laura, thank you. Welcome, everybody. We are recording this because we will be using this a lot going forward. This 3-part webinar series was really designed to culminate about 8 years worth of work from the private sector, from states, from NGOs, trade groups, federal agencies that have really come together here. And you're going to hear about, we tested something in the fall last year. And today we're going to talk about operational impacts here going forward of how we synchronize operations for logistics standpoint. So for those of you that are new, the All Hazard Consortium is a facilitation entity. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that works on public-private problem solving, has been around since 2005. So I want to give you a quick background of the consortium, but more importantly, the SICE, the Sensitive Information Sharing Environment. So let's jump into the roadmap here real quick. The slides will be made available for you. So the consortium was started in 2005 by states. DC, Maryland, Virginia started it, and then added North Carolina and Delaware, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New Jersey, New York, started expanding from there, primarily Homeland Security Emergency Management at the time. But something happened in 2010 where they started to get more involved with the critical infrastructure owner operators. And then Sandy struck in 2012. Well, right after Sandy in 2013, the private sector approached the All Hazard Consortium board and said, hey, we'd like to set up a work group underneath you all. The reason for that is the consortium is in Maryland, 501c3 is protected from FOIA, Freedom of Information Requests, which means they can have meetings without the media or outside influence or requests for meeting notes and all that stuff, which makes it very hard for government to avoid those. We can. So being a FOIA-free environment gave the private sector a place to meet with states and have some really no BS conversations and fix problems. So in 2015, the SICE was formed. The Sensitive Information Sharing Environment is run by the private sector. And they wanted to have a secure place they could partition people and information and let government in based on specific use cases, right? Not everything. They had B2B use cases. They had B2G, business to government use cases. So that's when the initial SICE framework was created. It was actually taken from the Defense Industrial Base model, which has been used by millions of people all over the world. 2016, DHS CISA got involved with the SICE through a challenge grant. And that helped the private sector formalize more of the legal framework, the use case process, starting working on the technical framework. 2017 was another hurricane season where we used that to respond to Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Maria. It was devastating. And the SICE became a kind of an information hub to coordinate multiple states and federal state agencies with these movements that were headed resources from all over the country to the East Coast and the Gulf Coast to take barges down to Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands for resources. So again, after the 2017 season, we formed the SICE Strategic Advisory Committee, which gave birth to federal, state, local government, and private sector advisory of the SICE, how it's to be used, what use cases can it work on, what are some of the initiatives going on within it. And it really started this kind of universal thing. It'd be great if we could start coordinating on information, but we didn't have the technology. Well, in 2019, COVID hit. We had funding we used to implement a top-notch Esri-based GIS system, which allowed us then to quickly organize information, both structured and unstructured data, into a tool. And now we could roll with different products for different use cases, right? So in 2020, we tested that. So now we had the technical platform in place, and we started building capability now that we could use along route planning, where we could show threats and resources along a route. We let the states have access to that in the fall. Bethany is on the phone with us from Alabama. She was one of the first ones, and I'll let her tell about her experience. And so here we are today, 2021. We are using this for the whole hurricane season coming up. It's a way that we can synchronize these operations. So if you're not familiar with the SICE, very quickly, it's a legal framework run by the private sector that allows community building, problem solving, research and development. It bridges the states with private sector in a very private way. We do that now person to person. We have chat and we have email, things going on. The SICE is going to formalize that through an initiative called SICEnet, which I'll talk about in just a second. So these things go on all the time within the SICE, and the products come out of that are technical products. There are policy products. There are other types of solutions we develop. So the Fleet Movement app is a culmination of data collecting over many years, now in an Esri framework that allowed us to meet a specific problem, which was how can private sector move their resources across state lines faster? First electric sector, then food and fuel and comms. And And we needed one place that was secure that states and industry could look at and monitor together at the same instant, right? It is not publicly open. We'll have a public available part of this later, but this is behind a firewall for a reason, because some of that information is sensitive. So it served beautifully the purpose it was designed to serve. And now they're working on the initiative called SICE-NET, using the SICE hub as a way to connect federal, state, local, industry, nonprofits on specific use cases. So the first one they're looking at is, how do we get all these people on the same page by coordinated damage assessments? Then we'll go to road closures. Then we'll go to weather. The idea is to have one place. The data is vetted. It's ranked. It's not in the SICE if it hasn't gone through a vetting system. So it's the best available data we can find out there. Some of it's fee-based and some of it's free, publicly sourced. So when you hear some of these terms mentioned, you'll know what they say. The SICE, they're talking about the kind of legal framework. SICE-NET is where we start connecting technically to states. Right now, Bethany and I share information through human-to-human contact, but SICE-NET down the road will put an MOU in place and allow us to push information technically, system to system. So I'm done with that. I hope that was helpful here, and I'm anxious to jump into our first topic today. So first, let me just, I'll be facilitating today, but I want to thank our panelists. These folks, if it sounds like we know each other pretty well, probably so. We've all been on calls every Friday some of us for quite a while. But you get to know each other pretty well when you start solving each other's problems. So we'll try to be acronym free. So I'll have everybody, if you reference a name or an acronym, please describe what it is. So the first session is really, how does this app in the SICE really affect situational awareness? First up is Dave Vanderbloem. And Dave was a longtime executive with Dominion Power in Virginia, retired, and Dave's been around the Fleet Working Group and the consortium for quite a long time. So Dave, if you'd introduce yourself first, and then we'll jump into a couple of questions on this topic.
Sure. Thanks, Tom, and thanks to my esteemed colleagues here that have joined us today. I retired from Dominion Energy in 2019. Right now I'm serving in a consulting role, spend a lot of time, at least once a week with Tom, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a week with Tom and Laura and Doug and Bethany. But through my 42 years at Dominion, I served in various positions, including started as a lineman. I've been in the emergency dispatch group, service representative, designing electrical service for residential, commercial, industrial customers. I've been an operations and construction supervisor. I've held several manager positions, general manager. But the last 12 years, I filled in a director role over local operations, and I finished off in regional operations center and emergency preparedness. During my tenure, I've been involved in numerous response events from Dominion Energy, more than I care to count or remember. I've led responding crews on both for events both on property and off property through the mutual assistance process. In my final 7 years, I served as the director of the Regional Operations Center in Emergency Preparedness, and in this role, I served as the incident commander for both on and off property events. I was fortunate to work with a bunch of extremely competent and experienced teams. And with this group, we developed, communicated, and implemented response plans to hurricanes, ice storms, derechos, and even an 82-person contingent that we sent offshore to Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria, which can be its own webinar, Tom. I've also served in numerous leadership roles in several trade organizations, including the Southeast Electrical Exchange Mutual Assistance Committee. I served on EEI's Mutual Assistance Committee on their Executive Leadership Board. And I was also a member of the Association of Edison Illuminating Companies, AEIC, on their Best Practices Group, where I co-chaired a technology group that looked over different technologies for responding to and working through emergency events. So in a nutshell, I guess you can see emergency response, including plans, logistics, communications, has been my passion, and I'm very fortunate to be here today. Thank you.
Dave, great, thank you. First question we have for you is from the industry perspective. Can you talk for a minute about some of the situation awareness and route planning issues faced by not just the electric sector? We'll start with the electric sector, but maybe the other sectors when it hits the fan, right? I'm looking at, for example, we got hurricane season coming up. We could have crews coming from 30 states, all headed to Florida. And can you talk about some of the logistic jam ups and the lack of situational awareness they have as they're moving across these state lines in towards the impacted zones?
Absolutely. Well, when you're preparing to travel cruise, whether they're on property or off property, several similar issues continue to pop up. Emergency declarations are one of them. Especially if you're traveling, well, even with Dominion Energy, we serve 2 states, right? Virginia and North Carolina. So emergency declarations in either can impact how you move your cruise. What are the real-time road conditions between point A and point B? It could be a short trip. It could be a 1, 2, or 3 day trip. Is fueling required? What's the availability of the fuel? You got to lodge these folks. If it's a multi-day travel event, you got to lodge them. Actually, when you get to, if you're off property and you're traveling to Florida, once you get to Florida, usually unless specifically identified, the host utility will take care of lodging you, but you're in charge of keeping your folks safe and lodged until they get there when they need to sleep overnight. How are you going to feed them? And then there's always the real-time emergencies that can pop up along the way, medical, mechanical, etc. So as you can see, there's just a ton of things that can impact you that you got to prepare for as you're sending folks from point A to point B.
So Dave, as crews move, there's utility crews, there's contractor crews, there's supply chain people. What are the challenges with situational awareness as they're moving from Michigan through other states? What kinds of things do they need to know about what's going on in front of them?
Well, I guess you mentioned a little bit earlier is that common operating picture. These events are fluid, and conditions are constantly changing. So having a platform or some type of technology that allows all the different stakeholders to view the same information concurrently is huge. That common operating picture, I can't speak enough to how important having that common operating picture. So everybody's looking at the same events, the same issues, real time. So, and that's what I think you mentioned earlier, why did we develop the SICE? It provides that platform where public and private partners can share critical, sensitive, trusted information to people who have been vetted, that are operational people, the people that need to know this information without fear of that data being misused or held against you in a court of law. Fuel availability, open close status, traffic information, medical facilities, and more recently, COVID risk, right? You're traveling through areas that may or may not be at different exposure rates. So having visibility of that is key.
And lastly, you've been involved in many of the use cases that have been developed, right? I was going to ask you to think of some examples where SICE solutions kind of illustrate, the point of how we aggregate information together by use case.
Well, the one that's near and dear to the electric industry is the Canadian border crossing. That was an issue. There are multiple. When you're in a big event, you can easily eclipse the resources that are available that are closer or adjacent to your service territory, and you might be getting folks that are across the Canadian border. Well, every one of those border crossings had different procedures, different processes, and the fleet working group identified that as being an issue and got the partners together to take a look at what are these issues, what do we need to address, and they streamlined those events. So now crossing the border, if you're a responding utility crossing the border, no matter where you, New York or Maine or wherever you're crossing at, you pretty much understand what's needed of you, and it really streamlined that process and got you from point A to point B. Also had the toll road issue with the Easy Pass that was addressed, where instead of having 50 bucket trucks lined up to go through and throw 35 cents in a toll booth, now you can zoom through those pretty quickly thanks to the use case and the folks getting together from a public and private partnership to get those folks from point A to point B.
Yeah, and Dave, speaking to those were non-technical solutions, right? Those were process solutions, and getting all the right people at the table was important, but that gelled because of state participation, right? I'll give a shout out to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York that were really involved in that. Those are big ones. So thank you, Dave. Bethany.
Yes, Tom.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Bethany, why don't you introduce yourself real quick, and then I got a couple questions for you.
Okay, I am Bethany Elliott. I'm the State Private Sector Liaison for the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. And our public-private partnership program is in its infancy. So right now, my focus is on building relationships with private sector partners and identifying ways to better integrate them into the emergency management efforts in the state, truly make them partners in that initiative. And I've been with EMA for a little over 2 years. Prior to that, I served with the Alabama Forestry Commission, and I worked with forest management with that agency. So I had some background in working with the private sector. The forestry industry is really good with incorporating their private sector partners into the supporting the forestry goals. And so I developed some relationships with that. So I have some kind of frame of reference on working with the private sector, and it's been very rewarding here at EMA. And we continue to grow our program. I've been very blessed to build some relationships and make some contacts with some other state liaisons across the country. And I'm really learning a lot from them, and that's helping us with getting our program off the ground.
Very good. So Bethany, I'd love to hear you talk about this. So can you talk for a minute so folks can understand how you were first introduced to the Fleet Work Group and the SICE, right? And specifically through this Fleet Movement app, right? How did it impact your situational awareness? If you could kind of talk to that for a minute.
Well, last fall, we had some hurricanes. We have those from time to time. And we had two just bam, bam, back to back, Sally and Zeta. And I was newly involved with the SICE working groups. I had just become a part of the private sector, state private sector liaison working group as part of the SICE network, and was new to that. And I was fortunate enough to get to sit in on some of the GIS committee meetings, also as part of that SICE network. And they talked about this wonderful thing called the Fleet Movement app. And I was, oh, what is that? That sounds fantastic. And the more they talked about it, the more I realized that would be so beneficial to us at the state level. I mean, I realize all the benefits it offers the private sector, but every time they would say something about what they wanted it to do or what it did or show me some feature of it, I just think that would be phenomenal for us on the state level. So that's how I became familiar with it, and kind of just used it a little bit for situational awareness during Sally and Zeta in tracking how fleets were going to be moving through Alabama, because Alabama is in an interesting position of being sometimes a destination state and sometimes a pass-through state, because so many of our states in a hurricane situation may be affected. Mississippi may have a declaration, but Alabama may not. So we may be in that particular case just the pass-through state for Mississippi, and then in the next storm we may be the destination state. So being able to track whether fleets are coming in and residing, setting up a staging area and staying in the state, working in the state, or whether they're just passing through, was very helpful. And it gave us some insight from a law enforcement standpoint. Where do we need to have some additional law enforcement to be able to help the fleets move through quicker, make sure there are no delays. Where do we need to make sure we have lodging available if they're going to be staying overnight? So just so many different ways that it increases our situational awareness, and I'm very excited about it.
Well, and just a comment as well, and I think Doug and Dave were on calls when you were talking about how the states could help. You were instrumental in getting information from the DOT out to a very broad audience, right? We were not aware of that. I remember you sent a couple of website links and PDFs, and that was really important, because you were the impacted state, right? And that's always problematic for crews coming from Michigan, never been to Alabama, right? To know what's going on there. That was really, really valuable. So that was definitely a two-way exchange, and we appreciated that. Can you talk for a minute about community of your peers. For those who don't know, years ago, the private sector wanted to establish a relationship directly with state liaisons for operational purposes during the storms. And so that group started, chaired by Persia Payne Hurley out of North Carolina, and grew to about 6 or 8 states. And now it's a little bit broader, but it's specifically designed for operational use. So Bethy, talk about for a minute how that's helped you during disasters. How does that group help you respond to, the issues you've been facing in Alabama during the hurricane season?
Well, an example would be, as I mentioned, in a hurricane situation, multiple Gulf Coast states can be affected at the same time. And even beyond Gulf Coast states, our hurricanes tend to travel all the way up through Persia's land up there in North Carolina. So we have a text chain. I mean, we talk weekly or bi-weekly as we need to. We exchange emails, but the most beneficial thing and that I think is a real-time text situation where we are exchanging information with each other as it happens. And so the moment Mississippi gets a declaration or declares a state of emergency, Mississippi puts it out there. And then the moment we declare, I put it out there. And so each state is aware of where the declarations are. We share our waivers. Once our transportation waivers are issued and go into place, we share that with each other, and then share with the fleet management group as well, so that they can update the app to say, okay, Alabama's got waivers in place, which helps the fleets know, what they're going to be looking at as far as weight restrictions and waivers on that. So the communication between the members of that group, and I'm so pleased to see it growing, has just been very beneficial to me. And beyond the disaster situation, we just text from time to time when maybe not a major disaster is occurring, but something's happening in our state, and we need some advice or we need some support. And it's just been a really good network. For me, being new to this, I've learned so much, and I feel like I'm not alone. I have people I can go to, and we have. During a lot of our meetings, we will bring in private sector partners to talk with us and give us a perspective on working with us. And it kind of lets us have some insight onto how challenging it is for them to deal with different states, because we all think our own state's an island. We're the most important thing. And talking to them has helped us realize, well, things that happen in Alabama are very different than what happens in North Carolina. And I guess when you don't look at it a lot, we all think, well, they probably do it about the same. And so the private sector reps have been able to tell us, well, really, you kind of don't, but it would be helpful if you did. So it gives us some insight on some things we need to work on to make a little bit more consistent processes when it's possible.
Very good. Thank you, Bethany. I crack up at the topics you guys cover on that text chain, from sports to, hey, do you know somebody here or know somebody there? It's really fascinating to watch you guys work, and I'm really honored to be part of that. Next up is Doug Baker. Doug and I met years ago through FMI. And Doug, if you take a minute, introduce yourself, your background a little bit, and we got a couple questions for you as well.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be a part of the conversation and having to get to know the All Hazards Consortium and interact with the folks. I've been in the food industry for, I had to count it up this morning now, 36 years. I started with Kroger, division of Kroger and store operations, then moved to product manufacturing with Kraft, Nabisco, into private brands. And for the last 7 years, I've been with FMI. FMI is a not-for-profit trade association that represents the food industry. And that would be anybody along the supply chain, from the one store operator up to the largest retailers within North America. We have members in 70 countries. Product manufacturers that produce food for those retailers and wholesalers, and then any company that's interested in working with them. Well, my opportunity, the areas of focus for me at FMI are our technology area, private brands, and asset protection, risk, and emergency response. We call those communities of practice because similar to the All Hazards Consortium, we're sort of a community organizer, and we bring those titles together in order to ensure that the industry continues to move forward in an efficient and profitable manner.
Very good. Doug, from the food perspective, can you talk for a minute about some of the issues your members face in the food sector during hurricane season with regards to, again, cross-state situational awareness and route planning?
Yeah, you know, the biggest, Tom, the biggest thing for us during a natural or human-made disaster is the status of the supply chain, right? It's understanding, you know, starting, if you think about it as a stream and you go from farm to fork, right? That's the supply chain for us. It's understanding that supply chain and its current status. So typically we spend most of our time at the store, moving upstream to the distributor or wholesaler, moving further upstream to the product manufacturer, then you go all the way into the farm. It's really about the people, the safety and their ability to be able to communicate with them, the building structure, the power, the roads, the equipment, the supply. But when you start looking at the impacted area, it's also about what are the states, as you know, as we just heard from Bethany, what are the states around that impacted area doing in order to support that situation? I was always fascinated by what the utility sector was doing and would love to figure out a way to emulate that with food, because a lot of times if an impacted area, if one of those entities is down, really wholesaler, distributor, or manufacturer, you've got to move typically outside of that affected area, that affected region, in order to bring goods into the area. So how can we work to do that efficiently in order to get those essential items back into the impacted area?
Right. Very good. Also, can you provide some examples of, you know, supply chain situation awareness needs? You all are facing a whole bunch of situation awareness needs that have come up over the last, as we were talking about before, from security, everything else. Maybe you can talk about some of the things your members need to know, right? Of what's ahead of them, what they're walking into, or what's the current lay of the land for them.
Yeah, yeah, situational awareness in our industry really starts at the first mention of a major weather event for retailers in the targeted region. So it's contacting our primary and secondary, and now as a result of the pandemic, in some instances, tertiary sources of supply, right? In order to be able to make sure you have contingency plans in place. A lot of times it's about ramping up that inventory on the essential items, securing assets, trailers. Sometimes we find ourselves in competition with the government because they're also trying to secure trailers in order to move product into that area. And so we end up competing with each other, which drives up rates, which really makes it inefficient and unprofitable for the businesses. You know, fuel, buildings, making sure that our buildings are secure, and securing cash. You know, it's interesting. You know, we're such a digital society these days, but you know, when you have an impacted area that could be down for several days, how do you continue to pay your employees? If I'm a small mom and pop in an impacted area, I need to continue to take care of my employees. So it's ensuring that you've got that ability to be able to do that. So not only having the cash, but having it secure. Materials. If you look inside of a grocery store, and having ran a produce department early in my career, you got to cover that stuff up, right? So it's as simple as thinking about what am I going to do to secure the food inside the building as a result of this event that's heading my direction, so that it doesn't spoil, so that it doesn't get damaged. It's raising product up off the ground in the back room to a higher level on the pallet. So there's a lot of activity that sort of like kicks into place in order to be able to ensure that that store is able to serve the community afterwards. It's also thinking about who and what waivers are in place. You know, hours of service, weight, Hot meals. Hot meals are extremely important when you have homes that have been damaged and people might not be able to do that for themselves. And then SNAP replacement. SNAP replacement is pretty significant from a state to state standpoint because SNAP, I'm sorry.
What is SNAP for those who don't know?
It's the Supplemental Nutrition Program. And so that allows people to use SNAP dollars to buy food in a grocery store. But because it's run from state to state, it's funded federally, but run state from state, and you select items within categories that are SNAP equivalent or SNAP able to purchase. If that store is out of that inventory of that particular SNAP item, typically you can't substitute another item for it. You have to get a waiver and special permission from that store in order for that consumer to continue to use their SNAP dollars, which are essential to them to feeding their family. So a lot of arms and legs.
Wow. Okay. Very good. Yeah, people forget this is not a simple thing. Let's move on to our next topic here. What have been the initial impacts to operations and logistics, right? It's one thing to have information and people connections, but if it's not applied properly and timely, then you don't have the impacts. But I think, and impacts change and vary. So Bethany, you're up first on this question. Bethany, can you give some examples of how the private sector information helped Alabama coordinate with the private sector during the 2020 season? You had some bad ones, no question, last fall.
Sure, Tom. During the 2020 hurricane season, we had heavy damage across several Gulf Coast states. And as a result, there were fleets moving across and coming into multiple states over the same time period. We had power fleets, commodities fleets. We even had med pharma fleets because we were still in the height of COVID. And we had all these folks moving across the region from state to state at the same time. Also during this, our counties and our cities were dealing with road closures, structural damage, lodging and retail closures due to the hurricane damage. Plus there were medical facility overloads and first responders stretched thin due to COVID. So while the fleets were trying to move to get hurricane response going, the counties and the municipalities were dealing with their own issues with regard to hurricane response and COVID response. So having the ability to look into the Fleet Movement app and give our local authorities a heads up on fleets that would be coming into the area and how that might affect them was invaluable, because it allows them to know, when there's going to be additional people in their area. And from an interesting standpoint, because of COVID, I think at the time, a lot of hospitals and medical facilities were just packed. And looking at it, I thought, you never want to think, if you're a private industry and you've got a fleet moving through, or the utility companies and they have fleets moving through, you don't want to think about having to utilize medical facilities, but there's always a chance. So if you've got a fleet moving through an area and the medical facilities are packed because of COVID, or, in the future, some other pandemic, that's something that they need to know. You need to be aware that in this area, hospitals are full. So that was a different perspective that was unique to the COVID situation, I think, that we don't always have to deal with. But having this information ahead of time allowed our counties and municipalities to staff accordingly, have additional paramedics on call, additional law enforcement on call. It helped them assure that the routes were clear to prevent delays. And it allowed them to communicate updates to us that can be communicated back through the app to the private sector. For instance, if you're planning on coming, down I-65, and all of a sudden there's a terrible wreck on I-65, now that route is closed, having that communicated immediately back through the app to the fleet group I think is very important, because they're going to have to make a change. They don't want to go that way if they're going to be stuck there for 2 hours. So that was very beneficial. And so that's how it helped us, and on a very basic level, because this was our first experience with it. So it was very basic, but it also something that I was able to do, and Tom, you mentioned earlier, was I was able to share our waivers and updates to the waivers and different documentation, our emergency declaration, so that the fleet group could put that. I mean, they attach it in the app, and so when you pull it up, it shows you the waivers and everything that involves, and that was very beneficial too. And it really helped us understand how those waivers are important beyond our borders, because we don't always think about that.
Yeah, well said. I'm not sure I totally understand it all either. Bethany, what other data, we talked about this over and over on the SICE calls, right? What other data might be useful from your perspective for states to assist with private sector movements? In other words, what would you like to know from private sector that would help you better support them? Anything come to mind on that? This is kind of data discovery conversation we do all the time.
Yes, it's very helpful for us to know the planned movements of the fleets. If they, and I know that they do a really good job of, from a logistics standpoint, planning out their routes in advance. And so if we have that information, look, this is the route that this group out of North Carolina is going to take to get to Louisiana. That really helps us with helping them, because it helps us make sure that route is clear. If it's not clear, we can communicate that back. It helps us staff additional law enforcement to help them alleviate delays. It helps us make sure we have waivers in place, because again, if we are just going to be a pass-through state and we're not necessarily a state with declared emergency, we can do a 24-hour waiver just to help them, get through the state quickly without the weight restriction and that type of thing. So it gives us some heads up on that, and allows us to make some adjustments on our end that would be beneficial to them. And we have some areas of our interstates. I'm sure everyone's heard of the catastrophic accident we had recently on the interstate. We have some areas that are more dangerous in wet conditions. And so if I see that a fleet is going to be moving through one of those areas, I can reach out to the fleet group and say, hey, in the app, please put a flag or a warning triangle or something saying, look, this is a dangerous area. You need to use caution through this stretch of road. And I can give them the exact, from this mile marker to this mile marker, you need to cut your speed. You need to be really observant. So I think that would be very helpful on both sides. It helps us alleviate accidents, and it helps them get through quicker. So then if we knew where they were planning to do staging areas, if they were going to do a staging area in our state, that would be helpful, because we could ensure that there are going to be basic provisions available. If it's going to be close to an area that's been hit in our state, then there may not be retail food available. There may not be grocery stores open, so they may have to plan to bring their own food, be self-sufficient. If they're not going to set up a base camp type staging area, if they're going to use a hotel or something in the area, then if they're having trouble locating a facility, we can assist with helping them locate the appropriate lodging. And we can help with communicating what facilities are open and closed. For instance, if we have a rest area that's closed along their major route, we can communicate that, because I know that they often, identify those. We have larger ones and smaller ones. So a lot of times they'll identify a larger rest area where they can stop. And if that's closed for some reason, we can let them know that. If there's limited lodging due to damage in the area, we can let them know that, if we are aware of what route they're going to take. fuel station closure or limited availability. You know, when we had the Colonial Pipeline incident, some of the fuel stations had limited availability. And that was something that we could communicate to let them know, hey, you need to fuel up before you get to this area because there's going to be only a few stations here. And then again, I mentioned the medical facility status. You know, we can just keep them aware of what the status of our medical facilities are at the time. And then I think it's helpful too for us to know, and I don't want to sound like the government here, but kind of what's being moved through. And here's the reason for that. If somebody's going to be moving through PPE, and like in the COVID situation where PPE was such a hot commodity and in such short supply, when there's a huge shipment of PPE coming through and somehow or another the media gets wind of it and it gets out there that, you know, 50 trucks of PPE came through Alabama. Alabama has no PPE. We just, you know, let them go right on through. If we have a heads up on that there's going to be like a media nightmare from that kind of thing, that really helps from our perspective. And that's just I guess a selfish thing on our part, but you know, any kind of way we can get ahead of things like that is always helpful for us and the private sector, because you know, it ends up a lot of times looking bad on both ends. So we can just work that from our end ahead of time. So you know, fuel, if fuel's going to be coming through, we like to know that because there's, you know, always some added risk with that. And so if there's going to be large shipments of fuel moving through, just a heads up on, hey, we're going to be moving through and here's what we're bringing. It's just, you know, situational awareness.
Yeah, and so much of that is not structured, right? It's done via email, text. And that's one of the things I know that the private sector is working on, is converting that unstructured information so it can be shared, right? Either through
Right.
The Fleet Movement app is the first of many that will be there. And the private sector is working on a data service for that so they can spew that out. But so much of that information is so valuable from the states. I don't think people really understand how much the states can do and want to do if they just know. Let me move. Doug, got a couple of questions for you, Doug. Deb, how do you see information helping the food sector operations within the impacted, you know, states during hurricane season, right? There's so much information. How do you see that helping you guys in your response efforts during hurricanes?
Yeah. So, you know, Tom, most companies, they have a transportation management system, what we call a TMS, and that helps them manage the movement of their trucks and goods. So think of it like a control tower. But it provides real-time visibility into where the truck's at. It provides dwell time. So how much time am I spending either picking up or delivering on the lot, because that's important time, and management, appointment management, and then even inbound ocean container movement, right? So that's what the TMS does. Where I see the app really sort of playing a key role is another layer of information on top of that provides additional data that is not probably currently included in the TMS, you know, like the COVID cases and some of the things that Bethany talked about. I was sitting here writing them down as quickly as I could. They were great. But it also validates some of the output of their current solutions. So for me, the goal would be for companies to bring the data from the app into their TMS and would provide them a broader picture for situational awareness in that moment.
Yeah, I know that you'll see that this hurricane season, Doug. They're working on an initial version of that. You know, privacy allowing, certainly, because some information they won't be. But what additional information do you think would be helpful from your perspective for the food sector to see or know about? Maybe you could speak to some of those future use cases that would be helpful.
I think for us, because so many of our stores are not, you know, they're not lined up along a freeway. right? Some of our bigger ones, like the Walmarts of the world, they're right off of a major freeway. But a lot of times, once you get off that freeway, you get off a major route, you go into a much more rural route. So when we talk about all emergencies are local, to the extent that we can take information down to the lowest, the most local piece of information that we can provide to those companies that are moving the goods, I think would be extremely helpful, because they spend a lot of time off of those major interstates and major under the side roads. So that would be really helpful. The other thing that I think is really neat about the app and about the SICE is the mutual aid that is provided. In our industry, we have a strong mutual aid mechanism as well, but it's very old school. It's one CEO picking up the phone and calling another CEO, or they've got established relationships and they just communicate. How can we automate that process under the protection of the SICE in order to allow both within our sector and across sectors to be able to provide mutual aid, equipment and materials and labor and stuff like that? That's another opportunity.
Okay, I'd like to invite you guys watching, if you have thoughts about this, just use the chat. This is discovery for future use cases, basically. So thank you, Doug. Dave, let me turn to you. Can you speak to how the information in the SICE it really started? The whole thing was driven by this electric sector use case, right, for moving resources across state line back in 2013. That was the first use case I think the Fleet Work Group started. Can you talk to how they organize that information, how it impacts operations in the electric sector?
Sure. And I think it's important for those that may not be familiar with the term use case. What you do is you identify an issue that's common to all of the stakeholders. And in this particular instance, we're talking about fleet movement, getting folks from point A to point B. And you get the key stakeholders together and talk about what are your challenges, how do you address them, and what do you do well, and what can you do better? And once you start looking at those things, you start finding out that folks are doing really good things, but they may not be using the same information. They may not be doing the same way. And it's not visible to other people that are trying to utilize that same information. So what the electric sector did with this use case was to identify what are the common issues, what are the most frequently asked questions, and we talked about the road conditions. There's the 511 information that's available through all 50 states. Well, if you're traveling from Maine to Florida, who has time to look at 7 different states' 511 apps to find out what's going on in that area? The waivers is another issue. Knowing that a waiver exists is great, but if I leave on Monday morning from Maine at 7 a.m. and I've got what is now all the known waivers that have been state of emergencies, and now boom, Virginia just declared. How do I know that? How do I find that information out? How do I get it to the folks that are at the pointy edge of the sword that are driving down the road? Fuel availability. So once you identify what those are, and then finding a common platform that brings that information available to everybody is crucial. So that is how you solve these issues, is you identify what the key obstacles are to being successful, and then you put them together in an application that makes it available to all the folks that need to see that information and are looking at that same data.
Right. And Dave, can you talk for a minute about the benefits from this? What have you seen from a cost impacts, optics, safety? What are some of the things you've seen as some of the operational benefits from this information, especially the information from the states, right? I mean, the states are critical input into this.
Well, to me, it's that common operating picture to everybody that's involved, whether you're the utility or the logistics people sending folks to help somebody, or you're the logistics people on the other end that's receiving the people, or you're the crews that are moving down from point A to point B. Having that information available at your fingertips, that same consistent information, no matter who you are in that process, is key. It's like, again, that's that cherished common operating picture that when you have it, it's excellent. When you don't, it's chaos. It's the foundation for every one of our plans, right? It's what every team member that I mentioned earlier is using to develop their strategy. And more importantly, it's the baseline for your communications. And Bethany made a point, good news travels fast, bad news travels even faster, right? And when you're chasing and trying to correct bad news, what aren't you doing? You're not doing your job. You are trying to stop rumors. You're trying to put out forest fires that are being created, and they're being created because we didn't have this common operating picture. We didn't have a communication strategy. So it allows you to focus all of your plans, all of your energy, and get your target audience has that one message with many voices. No matter who you are, you're always talking from that same piece of information.
Dave, any specific, from the cross-sector perspective, right? Within the sectors, people are pretty organized, but it's that cross-sector thing during hurricanes that come up. Anything you have seen from a cross-sector coordination, and including states, by the way, that come to mind as far as how this information benefits operationally from a cross-sector perspective?
Sure. I mean, from the fuel perspective, I mean, before these conversations began, nobody in the electric sector had any clue on how fuel moved from a barge out in the Gulf of Mexico to the gas pump where you're about to put into your tank. Nobody understood from a food perspective, if I'm driving down 95 and I need to stop and eat, where's that food coming from? How do I make sure that it's available? I mean, those conversations didn't exist. So this platform allows those conversations to take place, and it continues to develop different use cases, different data sets to help make sure that we're addressing the issues that are common or that overlap, that those interdependencies. So, I mean, I can't move from point A to point B without food, fuel, lodging, right? You can't do anything without electricity. None of it can happen without communications, be able to tell folks what you're doing. So all of these things, they're all interconnected. And if one fails, we all fail. So that's the interdependencies that are so crucial to having this data available.
Yeah, and one last comment, I think, I don't know who was talking about it, is it really isn't about the data and the tools. It's about the never-ending conversations and relationships that get built. And people could say, well, yeah, but you can't automate it. I said, if somebody learns how to fix it, I'd like to know. If people don't trust it,
the data is constantly changing, right? The data, what you look at right now will be different 10 minutes from now. So having a platform that allows you to update that data so that I don't have to make 55 phone calls and, hey, to Bethany's point, the I-65 just got blocked at mile marker 72. Well, I got 15 trucks that are driving down the road. I can't make 15 phone calls, right? That changes where my lodging is going to be. It changes where I'm going to get to. All those things are so dependent, and having them visible in an app like this is just it's unbelievable.
Well, I'm gonna move to the next topic. We could drill into that one for a while. By the way, at the end of this, folks, we'll have I'll put in the chat some resources. You can go learn more about it. Not just the Fleet Movement app. The Fleet Movement app is one of 6 that are going to be coming out, but it's all based on the data within our Esri platform and the relationships that share that information in a non-structured way. So it really isn't the app as much as it is the information shared by these stakeholders that are involved. So let me jump ahead to topic number 3. How does the app enhance overall route planning? I say, how does the information, right? The app just delivers the information, but how does that impact overall route planning? So Doug, I'm going to call on you first. Can you speak to a minute how the SICENet initiative, which you've been part of those discussions, using SICE to connect industry and state operations centers directly, right? And how that helps sync information like damage assessments and road closures. Can you speak to maybe some of the use cases you see down the road where states and private can work together to solve things or synchronize their information going forward from route planning or really general situation awareness, either one?
Yeah, sure, Tom. In the way I've sort of formulated this in my head and the way I view it is that the SICENet aspires to be a secure information sharing bridge, bringing several stakeholders and data sets together to synchronize a common operating picture for the public and private sector. So that, in my opinion, is really sort of the foundation, because when I stepped into this topic and stepped into this conversation, we had a significant trust issue between the private and public sector within food. I won't speak for the other sectors, but we had one within food. You know, I had heard stories of generators being commandeered, pods being dropped in the parking lot of a retail grocery store that was up and running and able to accept consumers. And that's important. It's not about giving away free food. It's about giving the community their lifestyle back, right? They just went through a traumatic event. The quicker you can get them back to some sort of normalcy, the quicker that community starts to get healthy again. And so, you know, being able to really expand the communication and the awareness, and the SICE does that. It brings these stakeholders together to have these conversations, to identify use cases that we can work through and address. You know, I mentioned one earlier that I really believe strongly that we need to figure out, and it's going to take a little bit of work because there's a lot of trucks on the road. But when we have trucks on the road coming from a state that's not impacted with a hurricane or some sort of event that's trying to get into that area, and they're continuously delayed or backed up because they have to follow certain rules and regulations from state to state, it slows that response time down. So I mentioned it earlier. If we could figure out a way to emulate what the utility sector is doing. Now, from a private sector standpoint, Bethany said it really well. We have to share our route. We have to share what's on the road, where it's going, why it's going there. And then the other thing that I sort of struggle with in my mind is, how do we identify those trucks? So you know which ones are moving for critical reasons and which ones are just moving into the area as normal course of business. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but I do believe that the framework and what the SICE and the SICE-Net has brought to this stage is the best position for us to move forward. And we got to have the state's cooperation. We've got to have that strong relationship between public sector and the private sector. And the states really are, they hold all the power. They hold all the opportunity to be able to support and guide. But I've turned it around on my industry and said, but you've got to communicate. You can't hide information because you're afraid, because you have trust issues. And over the last 3 years, a lot of that is chipped away, and we're really starting to see a difference over the last, at least the last 12 months. There was significant difference because collaboration was so important.
Yeah, and I know, Doug, you spend a lot of time, this is kind of off the cuff, you spend a lot of time working with FEMA and DHS, right, on these kind of macro issues, right, which are huge. Your membership is a massive thing. How do you see this type of ground up information helping to coordinate the multiple federal agencies and agencies within agencies, right? How do you see that helping them have better situational awareness so they can support you guys?
Yeah, you know, the pandemic was a great example of sort of a ground up activity. You know, typically hours waivers was a state by state activity. I mean, it just had never been done before. It's not that it couldn't be done, but then federal motor carriers put out a nationwide hours of service waiver, right? So it's also the opportunity, because we're having these conversations and they can only happen in this environment. It's looking for those inefficiencies. And why do we have them? And a lot of times you're going to find out that it's not anything that's written in stone. It's not a regulation. It's just not the way we've done it, right? It's changing and breaking a culture or a process that was just something we just continued to roll over from year to year and decade to decade. And now you actually have the opportunity to question why and how can we do it better? So working with, you know, FEMA and the MBOC, they've been great. And, you know, at the end of the day, it was what we were able to get to is, and I love it, is they want to help, not harm, right? So let the food industry do what it does really well, better than anybody can, right? And then when the government comes in, both federal and state, is how do we support that? to move that forward. And I had a running joke with FEMA is that until you guys are just sitting there writing checks, helping to support initiatives, we haven't accomplished what we need to in our particular industry to address crisis.
Right. And you're a member of the SICE working group, where do you see things going on this information front over the next couple of years? Where would you like to see this?
Personally, Tom, I'd love to see more retailers and product manufacturers as members of the SICE. Yeah, that's one of my short-term goals, is to get more people involved in the conversation. I enjoy being a part of it, but I'm speaking on their behalf, and I'd love for them to be involved. The value for me in SICE is bringing those stakeholders together from the public and private sector verticals to work on these important use cases. And though I have this idea, and you and I in the group can sit down and talk about it, it takes the actual practitioners to get into the conversation, to pilot, and to actually embrace these new opportunities that come together. So, for me, it's exciting that there's a platform there to do it. It's now, how do we grow it within our food sector with the right people to make the biggest impact?
Thank you. Bethany, a big part of this are the state liaisons that work together, right? And all the SICEs allowed you to do is to meet away from everything and just focus on your core issues that you all face. Can you talk about the group for a minute, and how they've organized themselves and how they share information during hurricane season is really the organization of how they set up and how they work together. And then I got a couple follow-ons for that.
Okay.
Once you're done there.
Well, the SICE gives us a platform, a confidential platform, which is very important. You know, the buzzword in government is confidential. So a lot of times we're not always sure what information we can share. But with this group, we're all government employees, and SICE has guaranteed us a confidential platform. So we can share whatever we need to get feedback. And that's really important, because I need, especially being new to this, I need Persia's expertise and Molly's expertise and Edie's expertise. And those are other state liaisons. I'm sorry, I'm throwing out names. I'm name dropping and nobody knows. But I need their expertise when I hit the wall. When I come across an issue that I don't know how to deal with that, I can reach out to this group and they will counsel me and guide me and give me suggestions on what to do to move forward. And I may not do exactly what they have given me, but I usually take some nugget from whatever advice they give and tweak it and use it and move on, and we get things rolling.
Can you share a couple examples? I mean, you've had some of these with lodging, with tarps. I remember one, you had a tarp issue.
Right.
To that for a minute.
After Hurricane Sally, we had a large ask for tarps. And when I say large, I mean tens of thousands of tarps that we needed in about 72 hours. We needed to get them quickly. And all I could think of was, well, let me go to the group. So I put it out there. Hey guys, I need a lot of tarps in a hurry. Like I needed them yesterday. Can you all put me in touch with some people that could help with getting us some tarps? And within, I don't know, 2 hours, I had a list of contacts of people to call. And I even had some of my fellow liaisons reach out for me. I started getting calls from, hey, so-and-so called me and said, you need some tarps. I can help with that. So, I mean, that was just invaluable. I didn't have to do a lot of research. I didn't have to ask Google and come back with 5,000 things and half of them not be any good. I had legitimate contacts that I could reach out to immediately. And if they couldn't help me, they probably knew somebody who could. So it was just a network, a chain that kept building. And that was really invaluable. And then something else that was helpful was during COVID, we talked a lot about what our states were doing, what was working, what wasn't working. As far as PPE, you know, we shared a lot of, well, here's where we're getting this and here's where we're getting that. And here's what we're paying for it. That was also beneficial to know, you know, who was paying what, because that, you know, prices were just all over the board. And then once the vaccination started rolling out, you know, in the beginning when you had group A and group B and group C, and that was just crazy. We were able to share, nobody had any best practices at that point. It was all, you know, this is what's not working. This is what we don't recommend. And so that was helpful on a lot of levels. But from that, we were able to kind of look at some of the states who did it well and build on that. And I mean, that group is just, they're my lifeline a lot of times. And then Tom facilitates a bi-weekly meeting for our group where we work on existing use cases and identify new use cases. And that comes from basically us just talking out loud about issues. And Tom will say, oh, that's a use case right there. And so we come up with a new use case. And then we get together every Friday with the other SICE working groups and the sector reps to talk through the use cases and hear updates on our current issues, what each group is dealing with. We usually get an update from CISA, which is, with all the cybersecurity stuff going on, has just been really crucial to all of us. So the SICE, it facilitates all that. It helps us do all of those things.
Bethany, where do you see over the next couple, 3 years, where do you see this going, or where would you like to see this headed from your perspective?
I really feel like in the next 2 to 3 years, this group, and I mean the private sector liaison group and SICE net as a whole, I see them bringing the private and public sectors together to create tools and best practices that will serve all of us, because that is, I just feel like that's our goal. You know, we all get together and talk through all these things with the goal of creating tools and practices that will help us in emergency management, disaster response. You know, it helps us accomplish things better, more efficiently, smarter. So I really feel like as we continue to work through the use cases, we will build those tools and best practices, and we will build a network of people who we know are focused and committed to these initiatives, because the group is just, it's jam-packed with people, really, really intelligent people. I always feel like I'm like the kindergartner there, just looking up like, wow, these people are so smart. But I mean, they're just, the way they roll off ideas and come up with solutions, they're just all committed to what we're doing. And that's really important. And I love the group. I just love it. And I think the information sharing will only improve as we realize how much that benefits everybody, and we become more comfortable with it through the SICE. I really feel like the information sharing will grow, because I mean, why not? Like with this app, if you've got something where the state can share information with the private sector and vice versa, and it's not any more complicated than, hey, you send it to this group, they get it out. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? It makes no sense not to. So I really feel like as we continue to develop tools like that, we will all realize, why wouldn't we do that? So that's what I see, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Bethany. Dave, from the route planning perspective, what are some of the problems facing industry, and how does SICE, the community, if you will, of states and industry, help address some of those, specifically hurricane season, right? It's kind of the practical ways. And you've been around this a long time, Dave. You've seen the footers when this thing was an idea, and you've seen it develop over time, and it's really taken on a life of its own. Consortium has very little, really, part of it. It's really the stakeholders involved. So I want to get your perspective on that.
Well, from a utility perspective, you've got three key stakeholders. There's the folks that are sending the resources, there are the folks that are receiving the resources, and then there's the folks who are the resources, right? So all three of these, need information. They need a plan, and I think that this app helps provide that. So from a sending utility, their mission, those logistics folks, their mission is to devise a plan to get the resources from my home company to your company as quickly and efficiently as possible. So the app provides you things like COVID exposure. I mean, if I'm traveling from A to B and I know, some counties are hotspots, I can devise a route to maybe help avoid some of those issues that may mitigate some of that risk. Emergency declarations and waivers, we talked about that earlier. I mean, they're being issued as you're moving. So you have a way to deliver those to the folks out in the field really quickly. Road conditions, again, those are always very, very, very transients, so traffic, construction, detours, flooding, but helps you put your plan together very, very easily. And then fuel issues identified. Remember, a utility vehicle is not a commercial truck that's driving, a tractor trailer that's built, streamlined to carry heavy loads. These are work platforms that have wheels on them to get them from point A to point B. So they may not be as efficient. They have different travel restrictions. They have different how far they can go in a tank of fuel. So understanding that this app was developed to give you that situational awareness, so you can develop the initial routes, keep your responding crews safe, and get them to their final destination. From a receiving utility, what's their mission? Hey, it's get those folks as soon as they reach the property, get them onboarded and get them out so they're responding to the event, right? What was lacking before is visibility. Where are they coming from? Where are they? When will they be here? And as they're developing their response plans, I mean, that's pretty fluid. So, when I first tell you that the crew from Virginia is going to go to this area in Florida, well, they're delayed. That area in Florida may no longer need them. So having visibility to where they are helps you get to, when they get on your property, get into the right staging area, onboard and get them to where they're needed the most. That helps them be flexible on arrival time and make sure that their messaging stays true and on target. And then from a traveling crew, what's their goal? I just want to get to work, right? I don't want to be in this truck for 3 days. I want to get from point A to point B as easily as possible, as safely as possible. So having access to the waivers, real-time traffic information. Before this app was there, knowing where the rest stops were and where fuel was, that was a crapshoot, right? I mean, if you've driven that road before, you know it. But if I'm a journeyman lineman, never done it before, I have no idea how many way stations I'm going to go through, or even do I need to stop. This helps you get through that. And before this app, it made it almost essential that your crews travel in big convoys. Well, that is not efficient. I mean, it may look cool going down the road, seeing 100 bucket trucks lined up from A to B, but that's not the way you want to travel. You want your folks, when they're ready, go. This app allows people to do that. So the app puts the travel waivers, fuel, traffic, lodging, and it also allows that crew the ability to deal with any emergency that comes up along the route rather than a reactionary mode, a proactive mode. So if I need some type of medication, if I have a mechanical issue, this app helps you identify those already been pre-identified. You can see where those locations are within 5, 10, 15 miles of where you are. You can get there, get it resolved, and move on. So I think that's what this app brings to the electric industry.
And Dave, from your perspective, where do you see the next couple of years down the road here of SICEnet and kind of more information sharing amongst public-private?
Well, you kind of mentioned it earlier. I've been with this group for a while, probably longer than I want to mention. But this sensitive information sharing environment performs that platform, where that foundation where public and private sectors can build the trust they need to be successful. Bottom line is we're all in this together, right? It's not the government against the private sector, right? We're all in this together. And it's a whole lot better to succeed as a team than then look for reasons to blame why you failed on each other. That's senseless. Data is a crucial part of this foundation. We need to continue to work together as partners to identify the data sources, use the operational readiness level process to assign those ORL levels. and that consistent guideline. And I think the overall results will be improved safety, increased efficiencies, better communications, and reduced costs. One thing for sure, new use cases are going to continue to be identified. No doubt, new data sources are going to continue to be developed. And I believe the possibilities for this group are only limited by your imagination and your willingness to trust each other and develop and share these technologies. And I think the sensitive information sharing environment is the tool that allows you to facilitate those partnerships. So I think I've watched it grow from an idea to this. And I'm not going to let my imagination limit me to know what's possible. I think anything thrown in front of this group can be tackled.
Very good. Thank you, Dave. Laura, we got some discussion coming up, and I've made a couple of notes myself here, so I'll turn it back over to you, Laura.
All right, Tom, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank you, Bethany, Doug, and Dave for being on the panel today. Really interesting conversation. I just wanted to remind all of our listeners that now is the set aside time for questions. So if you would like to enter them either into the chat or into the Q&A function, we'd be happy to hear from you. And I don't see any yet coming through, but we'll just give it a few seconds. Tom, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to, couple things for those folks that stayed on here. Laura, pull up the slide about resources here. I'm going to put them in the chat as well. The Fleet Movement app is one of many that will be put out by the private sector. It's really aimed at commercial users, right, in the private sector. The private sector grants some government access to this at the state level, and what's coming down the road are a open source version of part of that. Won't have all of it, but there's a data service the private sector is planning later on this year. And also there'll be an exercise this Friday. We're testing an exercise where we can actually, the SICE captures data for now 3 times a day on every storm. We've got backup, it's non-data, but from old storms, but we're going to be using that exercise. So deliver, we just had Hurricane Elsa last week. We could do an exercise on Elsa today because the Esri technology has allowed us to do this. So I really want to give a shout out to Esri and the folks that we have partnered with us. So the technology makes the information come alive, but where the fundamentals are built is in planning, never ending cross-sector planning. And that was kind of the first discussion question I had for all 3 of you. How has the cross-sector planning happened? And the consortium SICE isn't the only place this happens. This happens within trade organizations. This happens within ISACs. This happens a lot of places. But I just wanted to get your perspectives, each of you, is how has the cross-sector dialogue helped you in your sector? So Bethany, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Doug and Dave.
Bethany, you're on mute.
Thank you, Laura. The cross-sector dialogue has helped us. In the past, there's been a kind of underlying us versus them mentality between government and private sector to an extent. Government tends to withhold information and be hesitant to engage the private sector, and the private sector views government as regulators and bureaucrats and not overly excited about helping solve problems. So, for instance, in COVID forced us to come together and work together. We realized government can't make the wheels turn without private sector, and private sector sometimes needs government to grease the wheels. And so the collaboration between those 2 sectors, but then the sectors within the private sectors and the sectors within government working across those sectors. And I like to think of it as a flat plane instead of a hierarchy, because private sector is important, government's important. One doesn't trump the other. You got to work across, filter out. So, you know, if I have a issue with the food sector, and Doug mentioned it about the grocery stores in the small areas, and that's really important to states like Alabama because we are so rural. So many of our areas are small, and So if I can work across sectors and communicate across sectors to help my local municipalities, because as he said, all disasters are local. So you start local and you work out. A lot of people think with emergency management, you start big and you work small. You start at the disaster point, the local point, and you work out from there. So if they can tell me their issues and I can communicate that out across sectors and I have contacts across sectors, that's invaluable to helping the recovery effort, the response and recovery efforts move along quicker. And that's what we want. Our goal is to get people back to some semblance of normal as soon as possible. The worst thing in the world is, 3 months out from a disaster, you've still got a family of 4 living in a hotel and they don't have food and they don't have water, and nobody wants that. Nobody, government, private sector, nobody. So when we can work together across those sectors to enhance our response efforts and make them more proficient, that's extremely beneficial all the way around.
Doug, how about from your perspective?
I'd say, bottom line, Tom, it's best practices, right? It's about learning best practices from other sectors that don't exactly look like yours, but have to deal with some of the same issues. And how can you apply their best practices to make best practices for yourself? What Bethany said is exactly true. From a public-private sector relationship, there was some I don't know if they're perceptions. In some instances, they were realities. Many of them were perceptions that we had to get through and are getting through and improved dramatically over the last few years. Another example that I wasn't aware of personally until I became a part of the SICE was the understanding of how to support the utility sector, right? We can't do anything without electricity, right? We need electricity. And this group's coming in to fix. So we sit on pretty big swaths of land. How can our industry provide a staging area, for the utility sector, for the emergency response sector? So there's those things don't happen unless you're in these conversations and you're sharing this information. And through those activities, you create those relationships that are required in order to find the best practices to make the next crisis response much more efficient.
Good. Dave, thank you, Doug. Dave?
I tell you, the learning part for me is understanding from each sector what's critical to them for success. Because without those discussions, I can in my mind can think of what they are, but I can guarantee you that I'll be wrong. I don't know what's critical for Doug's organization. I don't know what's critical from the government sector, what they need to survive or to be successful. So I think this cross-sector discussions helps you identify, because if everything's critical, nothing's critical, right? Everybody's heard that, but it's true. I mean, it's no different if your electric panel box caught fire and you had to replace everything in it. You got a main breaker and a bunch of little breakers in there. You don't start replacing the 15 amp breaker to the porch light first, right? The first thing you do is you got to make the main breaker available. And then you need to figure out what's the next most important thing. And it might be the coffee machine for me. It might be, the bathroom for somebody else, but you have to have those discussions to determine what those are. And that's what this brings to you, is those discussions. So you can build a cohesive, comprehensive restoration strategy that fits everybody into that picture.
Yeah, and I have to thank the ISACs actually for helping us use some of their processes to facilitate that, because I know when you get in a cross-sector environment discussion, it's hard to stay focused on the one thing because everybody's got their one thing, right? So getting that group to get Denise Anderson, I watched Denise work for a long time, and she's very good at this, is getting people to focus on that and then turn them loose. And I think that's where the energy, Bethany, that you walked into is the energy around people turned loose on one thing, one problem at a time, right? And there's really no limit. It's been very interesting to watch. So we're coming up on the hour here, or the time frame, Laura. I'm going to turn it back over to you. Doug, Bethany, Dave, thank you very much. It's been very great to have you again talking. And of course, we have an exercise Friday internally where we'll be using the app to drive a discussion around process for the hurricane season, which we'll make public. So Laura, let me turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Tom. Thanks again to the three of you and Tom for speaking today. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this virtual discussion, this is number 2 in a 3-part series. So if anyone who is watching today is interested in seeing a demo of the app and learning more about the technical perspective of what we just heard about today, that's taking place tomorrow, same time, 10 a.m. If you haven't registered yet, we're still accepting registrations at ahcusa.org. I did put that URL in the chat box about 5-10 minutes ago. And so we welcome you to join us. And also please pencil in, I know it sounds so far away, but it's really right around the corner, January 25th through the 27th for the All Hazards Consortium's 2nd Annual Resilience Exchange Summit. And that is 3 days virtually, and you'll get more discussions like we're having today. So if you like what you see, we encourage you to join us for that. And there's be no charge for the registration. Again, you can find more information, and we're still developing the agenda on that, but at our website at ahcusa.org, and just click the events tab, and you can see who we have together so far. And I wanted to say thank you for attending. I've put my email address up on the screen here. So if anyone has any questions, if you're interested in speaking, or if you want to hear any more information about what you heard today, feel free to reach out to me or Tom if you have his information, and we'll be happy to share more information with you. So I do believe that's the end of our virtual discussion. I just want to say, everyone, thank you for coming, and hope you got something out of today's discussion, and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.